Welcome to the second lecture on the Kaiser years. Today we will examine the Kaiser's foreign policy by examining the question, why was Weltpolitik a controversial policy? We will first examine what the term Weltpolitik means and why the Kaiser decided to make this the focus of his foreign policy. We will then link this to the naval race between Germany and Britain. Then we will look at the rise of the Social Democratic Party as a result of rapid urbanization in Germany's cities. We will then examine the opposition that the SPD posed against the Kaiser's Weltpolitik. Weltpolitik simply means world policy. It specifically relates to the Kaiser's desire to build up a world empire. His grandfather, Wilhelm I, had been the King of Prussia, and he had unified Germany into a larger empire in the center of Europe. Kaiser Wilhelm II wanted to build upon this by looking to create a global empire. The phrase, "a place in the sun," was coined during World War I to describe Kaiser Wilhelm's desire for an empire. By the turn of the 20th century, most European countries had already established their empires and had even gone to war with one another to fight over prime territory overseas. The phrase, "place in the sun," is somewhat derogatory to the fact that Kaiser Wilhelm would need to conquer what little parts of the map had not been conquered by other nations. This map shows the German Empire. You can see that most of the overseas colonies were in Africa with some small ports in Southeast Asia. While the colonies in Africa look large in terms of landmass, they were largely barren with sparse resources. In contrast, the British Empire by this point occupied 1/3 of the globe, including several essential trading ports. The colonies in Africa essentially formed a corridor from the bottom of South Africa to the Mediterranean Sea, and so they dominated the trade routes and resource management of the continent. This is a political cartoon from 1898 that shows the imperial ambitions of different world players. Britain, France, Russia, Germany, and Japan were all fighting for territory in China. Here you can see Queen Victoria with her two grandchildren, Kaiser Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas. The knives and Japanese samurai sword shows that these imperial ambitions will result in a world conflict. When you look carefully, it is Kaiser Wilhelm who is the most aggressive player around the table. This shows the Prussian militarism discussed in the past lecture, but also the fear of the other European powers. The Kaiser never does gain any land in China, since the First World War breaks out before he can make further imperial advancements. Let's now link the Kaiser's imperial ambitions to the growth of the German military. In order for Germany to keep hold of their small empire, they needed to grow their navy. Not to defend against native populations, but against their European rivals. During our last lecture, we discussed the Kaiser's rivalry with his cousin George V. At the time, Britain had the largest navy in the world and used this to defend their great empire. Kaiser Wilhelm decided that he didn't just want a navy to defend his newly acquired colonies, but to try and rival his cousin. This meant that a large portion of government spending was allocated to building up armaments, especially battleships. This triggered a naval race between Britain and Germany. The focus was on battleships, namely dreadnoughts. As you can see, by the start of the war, Britain was winning the naval race, but Germany wasn't too far behind. To fund this huge armament program, the Kaiser used foreign loans, specifically from America. This would have a devastating impact on the German economy, especially after America joined the war on the side of the Allies. The naval race and the Kaiser's Weltpolitik stoked two of the main causes of the First World War, namely, militarism, the building up of armies, and imperialism, the building up of empires. This quote from the British sitcom Blackadder provides a satirical but astute interpretation of events. Blackadder says, "The British Empire at present covers a quarter of the globe, while the German Empire consists of a small sausage factory in Tanganyika. I hardly think that we can be entirely absolved of blame on the imperialistic front." This shows how no one country was to blame for the outbreak of World War I, but how the Kaiser's ambitions stoked the fierce competition. It also explains why after their defeat so many German people resented having to take on the full responsibility and guilt for the start of the war. Let's now examine the rise of the Social Democratic Party, who were the only organized group to vocally oppose Weltpolitik. At the turn of the century, Germany was going through rapid urbanization since people moved from the countryside to the cities in search of work in factories. This had a profound impact on the political consciousness of the ordinary German people. Imagine this circle is Germany before this pattern of rural to urban migration. An ordinary peasant that lived in the middle of nowhere might complain to his neighbor about his lot in life, and the neighbor might agree, but they could make a very limited impact. This is because most communities were isolated and very few people had the right or the desire to vote in elections for their representatives in the Reichstag. During a time of heavy industrialization, peasants would often struggle to find work in the countryside and so would move to the cities. In Germany, many of these large industrial cities were in the north, such as the capital of Berlin. When they arrived, many found that working conditions were far more horrific in the cities, with long working hours, low pay, and very few safety regulations in the factories. However, when they complained about it, their voices were heard together as a collective. Workers started to form trade unions in order to demand better working conditions. They also became more politically conscious and so looked to place pressure on the government to achieve more rights. Socialism became a popular political ideology. It is the belief that industry should be owned by the state and regulated for the good of the people. This should then lead to a more equal society and greater worker rights. Karl Marx believed it was the stepping stone between a capitalist society where industry was under the private ownership of rich factory owners and communism, where the state owned everything and distributed it equally among the citizens. The Social Democratic Party used socialist principles to advocate for worker rights, and they became increasingly more popular throughout the first decade of the 20th century. By the 1912 election, they won 35% of the votes and so became the largest party in the Reichstag. The SPD, under their leader Friedrich Ebert, became highly vocal in their opposition to Weltpolitik. They did not believe the Kaiser should be spending so much on the naval race when there were workers who were living with a poor quality of life. This cartoon was made by the Social Democratic Party in 1908 to criticize Weltpolitik and the building of dreadnought battleships. Germany is represented as a warrior queen, who is proudly displaying her fleet of dreadnoughts. The man represents the people of Germany tasked with the mission to defend her empire. The caption is satirical. The people ask if the fleet is paid for, and Germany replies that no, it is all on borrowed money. Therefore, the purpose of this poster was to inform the ordinary people of the debt that the Kaiser had accumulated in order to build up his fleet of dreadnoughts, and to show people that the Kaiser's military ambitions were little more than a facade. These posters worked up until 1914 and the SPD gained popularity. However, when the war broke out, the SPD saw a temporary dip in their popularity as they were seen as an anti-war party, and this meant they were perceived as unpatriotic. Let's return to our overarching question of, Why was Weltpolitik a controversial policy? Firstly, it is important to remember that Weltpolitik refers to the Kaiser's world policy, specifically his desire to gain a place in the sun in the form of overseas colonies. In order to both gain and keep them, the Kaiser needed to build up the navy. Since the Kaiser was determined to rival his cousin George, Germany ended up in a naval race with Britain, and this meant that Germany ended up taking out foreign loans from America to afford their armament program. As this was taking place, the Social Democratic Party was gaining popularity in the industrial cities, especially in the north of Germany. This is because workers liked the political ideology of socialism since it offered a fairer system for them. The SPD were vocal in their opposition of the Kaiser's Weltpolitik, especially due to the level of debt it was accumulating. The SPD believed that money would have been better spent on worker rights, such as introducing more safety regulations in factories. However, just before the First World War, this led to a dip in their popularity, since the Kaiser's government claimed that their anti-war policies meant that they were an unpatriotic party. Ultimately, Weltpolitik was controversial for two reasons. Firstly, it made war with Britain far more likely. Secondly, it cost far too much money that could have been better spent improving the lives of urban workers. Thank you for watching. Please tune into my next lecture to understand how life changed for the ordinary German people during the First World War.